I was not really thinking about an apocalypse as much as I was thinking about the experience of those two very young women alone in the forest, and what they would learn and what they would be how they would be challenged by being sort of cut off from everything else. So that was kind of the first thing that drew me into the story, and then I had to create a reason for them to be so cut off. So maybe get rid of the rest of the world, which was a very lucky thing, because it allowed me to think really deeply about sort of where we are now and what might happen next. It wasn't that it wasn't a subject for me. The whole book was informed, the whole story was informed by my urgent sense that we couldn't keep living the way we're living. And so that things were going to change. It was inevitable, especially, you know, in America, in the first world, our methods of consumption and pollution, and obviously climate change were going to change things. And so that was a you know, a sort of very compelling part of the story to me. But for me, it was a much more intimate, closer look at human beings in relationship to the natural world. So the apocalypse is kind of out there, and it's the forest that's. Into the Forest, especially these days, gets kind of shelved with post-apocalyptic fiction, and or even more than that, dystopian fiction. And I keep trying to say it's not really a dystopia, you know. I think it's more hopeful than that. Yeah. So it's sort of shelved that way. But my experience is that most readers, when they get into the story, are there in the forest. All writers are always writing about now. Even if we're writing historical fiction, or even if we're writing, you know, sci-fi fantasy, the questions that inform what we're writing and the experiences that spark our imagination have to do with right now. So, I mean, I think in one way that's what we always do, and but. Certainly for Nell's journal, you know, it's the right advice. It's try to understand where you are right now and explore that moment. I mean, we're always trying to find the accurate narrative for our lives, right? We're always trying to find the story that's most true about who we are and where we want to go. And so writing about now is one way to kind of get there. It was very much my sense in the book that I wanted to stay with the girls' experience. And the girls would have no idea, really, what was happening out, you know, in the world. And they'd have no idea why they were in the situation they were in. And so they would only know about the now. And yeah, maybe history someday would explain why they were in that particular apocalypse, but they're not going to know that. I mean, I was trying to stay so close to the girls' experience, and their experience would have only been, I mean, there would be no authority saying this is what's happening and this is why it's happened. Their experience would always be, you know, the rumors and the stories that are trying to explain, and their own kind of sense of what's going on and trying to explain, which is a little bit I mean, always our experience, right? We get narratives from so many different directions, and somehow we have to try to make sense right now of our experience. I mean, there is something that, very essential about our nature and who we are that civilization tends to mask. And I think that if we spend our lives clamped to screens inside of houses, we're going to lose a really profound understanding of who we are and where we are. For me, the novel serves as a metaphor. It's not a recipe. It's not saying we all need to, throw off our clothes and run into the forest, right? But it's saying, I think, for me, it's this kind of very urgent message that we do need to kind of rediscover our essential nature as ephemeral animals on this on this planet. And I think that civilization has a lot of sort of trappings that get in the way of that. I mean, it mediates our experience. As consumers, it's like, oh yeah, I'm thirsty, here's a bottle of water. And oh, I can, go online and order a new whatever. And oh, I've made trash, I'll just throw it away. And so there's this kind of glorious aspect to that, isn't it? I mean, we're so lucky we can not have to care about those things. Or at least we haven't up, till very recently, I think. Both of these young women have had these passions that have sort of, on the one hand, may encourage them to stick with a kind of unreal expectation of what's going to happen next for way too long. Nell's going to go to Harvard, and Eva's going to dance with it, and in one way, those passions have seen them through. I mean, Eva keeps dancing to the metronome, and Nell, you're right, discovers writing in a way that she hadn't before, and but in the final scene, for me, what's happened is both of those passions have changed. Eva's dancing in a new way. She's dancing very passionately in front of that fire, but it's no longer ballet. Yeah. And Nell says that, or intimates that she's not going to continue to keep the journal, but she says she's too much of a storyteller to give up stories. And so for me, however we tell stories, it's the stories that are, the defining characteristic of human beings. I mean, I think that's what makes us human, more than, tool making or language or anything else. It's that we use narratives to understand the world. And Nell is saying, at the very end, she may no longer write in the journal, but she'll always be a storyteller. The story visits grief in many, many different ways, yeah. and loss after loss after loss. Loss of their parents, loss of this future, loss of Eva's, sexual innocence and experience, and so it's grief after grief after grief, and early on in the novel, Nell talks about that kind of, that sort of unexpected and almost obscene joy of the survivor. Mm-hmm. And she talks about it in several different places, and of that kind of freedom that comes from, that loss. And so, I mean, I think the novel really celebrates grief, and it also comes to this place where all that loss is also a potential new beginning. Burning the house is definitely symbolic of that, isn't it? It's like, just get rid of the past. There's no way we can live there anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, the encyclopedia has a kind of precarious role in the book, right? Because the father, who's the educator, says burn all the encyclopedias. You know, he says this is silly. And Nell, who's very immature, I mean, she's a kid, and she gets this grand idea that she will know everything if she reads the encyclopedia. And so it's this, for her, the encyclopedia begins as kind of this symbol of all knowledge that her father, who's an educator, is wise enough to see, like you know, isn't true. And then there's that point in the novel when Nell realizes the encyclopedia is not going to help Eva give birth, and there's, you know, there's a whole world of understanding and knowledge that's outside of, you know, those cages. Yeah. Oh yeah, oh yeah. I had so much fun, you know.
Yeah.
Because
It's like a program in a way.
Right.
We lived that.
Yeah,
No?
exactly. Yeah.
And are we going back from electricity to Eden?
Yeah.
J'espère. Qui sait? Yeah, I mean, I think most of us have. I mean, even with how are we going to spend this $100 that we have, right? I mean, do you save it and try to make precautions for the future, or do you inhabit the moment as fully as you can? And I mean, I know that I have those two tensions in myself all the time, and so the two sisters, being sisters, of course, are carving out separate territory for themselves, you know, inside the family. But I think they also have these kind of original natures, you know. So Nell is the person who's conservative and wants to save things and keep things and plan and be prepared, which are all good qualities. Those are good traits. And Eva's the one who, you know, wants to live right now and trust that the future will take care of itself. For me, fiction is much more interesting if it explores situations and tensions than if it offers solutions. You know, I want the exploration, and I'll, as a reader, come up with my own ideas for solutions. And I think, I mean, most of the solutions are bigger than any novel, right? So yeah, for me, it's kind of living in those tensions and exploring them and finding a way to kind of really inhabit them inside a story is what's interesting. I mean, especially with the sort of the large topics that novels try to take on, any solution that a novel can find inside the novel is going to be probably too small. I mean, if, you know, a novel tries to understand generational relationships or understand love, and if I think a novel is a really good container for exploring, you know, the complexity of relationships between generations, or, you know, romantic love or the natural world. But to me, when novels try to come up with sort of easy, you know, solutions for those problems inside the novel, they're too easy and too small. So Nell's the younger sister, and they've grown up, you know, in this very kind of tight family without a lot of, you know, outside intervention, and so one thing that Nell has done is kind of create herself in opposition to Eva. So it's like, if Eva's going to be this, then I'm going to be this. She's kind of carving out territory that Eva hasn't already claimed. I don't know if the novel says it as much as it's just what I think now very, very strongly, that we need new stories.
Yeah.
We have to have new stories because the old stories have sort of taken us to the precipice, and I mean, in one way, Into the Forest is an attempt at a new story. I don't think, you know, I mean, Nell's observation at the end that, you know, I'm still a story keeper, I'm still a storyteller, and her love of those books that she has to say goodbye to. I mean, that she's not burning those books gleefully. That's incredibly painful to her. And she's, you know, she's saving a few books, even though she knows that's, you know, in one way foolish. So I don't think this is a story about getting rid of stories, but I think that it definitely suggests that we need new stories. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think so. I mean, it's very, you know, all the stories about the sky gods and all the stories about, you know, life beyond this life, and, you know, all of those myths are not going to serve us very well. And you know, that sort of the Starhawk's idea of you know, be here, be in this world, I think are I think those are the stories that are going to serve us better. We've grown up in this world where power / electricity is something that we just assume, we take for granted. And a generation ago, I mean, I've spoken with people, you know, elders who've read this novel, who say, oh yeah, we didn't have electricity when we were growing up. You know, we didn't have hot water, you know. In fact, one of the women I spoke with said, the most wonderful, wonderful modern invention in the world is hot water, hot running water. And, you know, for us, I mean, for certainly my generation and, you know, everybody after that, it's like hot water is a given. Hot water comes from God, you know. And so I think that relearning that those things aren't givens and aren't necessary. And there's a great deal of power in being able to live a rich, full, meaningful life without those things. I mean, I think that's one of the empowerments of the book. I think Jesus couldn't have been a woman because I think that Christianity is a terribly patriarchal religion, and you know, it's all about giving power to men, and I think that you know, so a little bit my voice going through Eva's, but I think Eva would agree with me that it would have been a very, very different story if there were a sort of if there were a story about a woman sacrificing herself for you know, out of love for humanity. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly an imaginable story, and arguably women do that every day. And men sacrifice too. But I was reading a number of American feminist theologians at the time that I was writing this book, and a number of them were arguing that these attempts to sort of make Christianity more inclusive of women were were not going to work. You know, even attempts to you know, to make women, give women larger roles in the church, and were not going to work because doing that meant that it was no longer Christianity. That's what these, you know, feminist theologians were arguing. It would have been a very different story. It'd be a really interesting story. I mean, that's the story that, another thing that I was really interested in doing when I got the idea to write this book was to write a story about two young women in the forest, because the story has always been about the guys in the forest, you know. And I mean, there's wonderful, I grew up on them, I loved them, all those stories about, you know, men surviving in nature. And so two boys in the forest would be a great story, but it too would be very different. No. My joke is that my imagination is not big enough to have ever imagined what would have happened when, you know, Edition Skullmeister published Into the Forest. This book has had an interesting, at least for me, kind of life out in the world. I had a hard time finding a publisher for it at first. I was told that it was set in the near future, but it wasn't science fiction, so there was no, you know, they didn't know how to categorize it or shelve it, so that wouldn't work. It was about very young women, but it was, you know, a grim, hard, sad story in many places, and that was inappropriate, you know, to write about teenagers having trouble. So this, you know, things have changed since then. And, you know, it was finally published by a feminist press, a small nonprofit press, and then picked up by, you know, a larger press and translated into a dozen or so languages. That was, you know, I was very, very gratified by all that. And now this moment, you know, in the French translation has been totally unexpected. And of course, really exciting and gratifying. I mean, it's just wonderful that this book is getting this new life with all these new readers. And it seems as though there's something about this moment, you know, this time with collapsology and, you know, all these concerns kind of growing sort of larger and closer, that it's allowed it to kind of resonate again. I am not a reader of dystopias and post-apocalyptic fiction, so I hadn't, you know, I didn't have those conversations in my mind when I started this book. So I didn't have those kind of tropes to work with, you know, for better and worse. For me, I think it gets back to that idea of grief and loss, that that it was really a story about when we get to the point, you know, in our own lives, in a metaphorical way at least, where we've lost everything, what is still there? You know, what remains? What are the things that that we can count on to endure? And, you know, so it's for me, it was kind of this exploration of, you know, if you strip away this and you lose this and you lose this and you lose this, then what do you have? At the end, what do you have? And for me, in this novel, what you have is human relationships, maybe not a whole intact family, but a little bitsy beginning family, and the natural world, and art. I love teaching creative writing. I really, really love it. I'm lucky because I think I'm lucky because I've been teaching at a junior college, and I mean, you know, I teach at workshops and in different venues too, but mainly it's been at the junior college. So most of the students that I work with are, some of them are very, very serious writers and have gone on to have, you know, really exciting careers, and many of them want a form of self-expression. And so it really is kind of revisiting, you know, what does it mean to tell a story? And what does it mean to kind of find the stories that you want to tell? And so in some ways it's kind of getting back to the essence, you know, of storytelling. I love working with people. I talk a lot about craft. And I sort of look at it, I mean, the way I do it is kind of look at the different elements of fiction. So, you know, characters, and how do you find characters, and what makes a compelling character, and how do you kind of learn enough about your characters to make them real enough to you so that you can make them real to other people. And you know, plot, and what is a plot, and how do plots work, and how you know, how can you create a plot that explores the story that you want to tell, and you know, scene, what's a scene, and you know, versus a summary, and how do you kind of develop a scene in a way that's, you know, compelling and not boring, and, you know, rich, and what is setting at. And so I sort of invite students to you know, think about all these different elements, because it's America, we do a lot of workshopping, right? And so students share their work with each other, and in sort of small, supportive, honest groups. And I'm an evangelist when it comes to revision, and you know, that the first draft is not a final draft, and there are effective and valuable strategies for kind of working one's way through the process. So you would be using different strategies and different techniques on, you know, that first draft than you would be on a final draft if you're talking about revision. You're not going to be focusing on trying to revise the same things. It's pretty much self-taught. I mean, I don't have a MFA or, you know, degree in creative writing myself, and so it's writing and thinking and reading and you know, experimenting with students, and you know, what works and what doesn't. Pacing, I think, is really, really important. Barbara Kingsolver, you know, the American writer, she says, as writers, the deal we make with readers is, you give me 10 hours of your time, and I'll give you a reason to turn every page. And so, you know, it's that understanding that readers are giving up a good deal of their life to, you know, spend time with this book, and but you've got to give them a reason to keep reading. So for me, there's a lot, you know, very late in the process, once I've found the story and discovered the, you know, the characters and you know, really what the story wants to say, I spend a lot of time working on pacing and you know, trying to keep readers reading, but not reading too quickly, because you don't want, you know, yeah, I work hard on every word, so by God, I want, no, don't go too fast.